Data about police use of force, useful or a huge mess? It's data that's collected nationwide by police departments. In fact, the U.S. Department of Justice has been required to track excessive force complaints since 1994, but there's little to show for it. From the GateHouse Media studios, I'm Dave Morris. The federal government has recently released a study. It's from a 2016 survey by the U.S. Bureau of Justice Statistics. Kenny Jacoby, he's the National Public Safety Data Reporter for GateHouse Media. He joins us right now. Good morning, Kenny.
Good morning.
Thanks for your time today. You have taken an in-depth look at this data, so let's start right there. Tell me about this survey and what sort of data are we talking about?
Yeah, so this is a survey that was distributed to about 4,000 police departments across the U.S. Back in 2016. And the primary purpose of the survey was to examine police departments' adoption of body-worn cameras. But as part of the survey, the Bureau of Justice Statistics, which put on this survey, decided to add some questions about police use of force, and specifically citizen complaints into police use of force. This was as part of an effort to collect this data for 25 years, which the federal government has never been quite successful at doing. So they added some questions about the number of complaints received by each department into excessive force and how those complaints were resolved.
Let's talk about a little bit what you just said there. This is a federal law that goes back over 2 decades, right?
That's correct.
Also, what do they define as use of force? Was there any sort of basic groundwork that everybody could compare so that we have apples versus oranges, or perhaps is that where the data gets messy?
That is one place where the data gets messy. So there is no national definition that's uniformly used by every police department as to what actually constitutes force and then what constitutes excessive force. So every police department essentially has their own way of classifying things.
And you mentioned police forces. There's over 4,000 law enforcement agencies that were a part of this survey. How many of those have body cameras, and is that also a consistent thing?
So at the time of the survey, which was 2016, about half of them indicated that they had body-worn cameras, or at least in some form. Could have been just a pilot program or testing. And as part of the survey, they were also required to answer some questions about, why they didn't have body cameras, if that was the case. A lot of them said they had either privacy concerns or just cited the high costs of implementing a program.
Talking with Kenny Jacoby here, and as you dove into this data, you were looking at departments all across the nation, several agencies from Fayetteville to the Harris County Sheriff's Office in Texas. Describe some of the things that you found in this reporting.
Yeah, so when we first ran this data through our processors, what stood out to us was just the wide disparities in how each police department adjudicated complaints of excessive force. So whereas the national average had the rate of sustained allegations, meaning that the complaint was that the department agreed with the complaint and that disciplinary action was justified against the accused officer, that rate was about only about 1 in every 15 allegations. But yet we saw some police departments, like in Fayetteville and Harris County Sheriff's Office, where they, according to the data, sustained around 80–90% of complaints. So that kind of was a head scratcher. When we reached out to those police departments, though, they told us that the numbers that we're seeing in the data are wildly inaccurate, and they cited much lower numbers of sustained allegations.
You also spoke with Matthew Hickman. He's the chair of the Criminal Justice Department at Seattle University, but he's also a former statistician with the BJS. And what did Mr. Hickman tell you?
So Mr. Hickman, he's an interesting character because he worked for the Bureau of Justice Statistics in the early 2000s. And while he was there, he was one of 2 people in the law enforcement division. And he decided essentially to take it on his own initiative to start collecting this data. Going back to the fact that this law had been passed in 1994, which required the federal government to collect the data and for the Attorney General to submit an annual report on it. Essentially, Dr. Hickman said, since that had never been done, they were going to try and do that on their own. And they decided to look at citizen complaints of use of force or excessive force because that was a measure that was a good indicator that police chiefs use to determine the quality of their interactions with civilians.
All right, so let's dive into a little bit of the details here. What does this data tell us? And as users and readers are diving through some of this data, what should they be looking for? What might be easily for them to understand on this?
Yeah, so the one thing that everybody wants to know first is how often do police departments actually sustain an allegation when a citizen complains. So, for example, I have an interaction with police. The police uses force on me. I think it's excessive. I complain to my police department, and then they go through an internal process to figure out whether that use of force was justified or not. And the data altogether show that about 1 in 15 allegations actually met the threshold for disciplinary action against the officer, meaning that the police department agreed that the force was excessive. Most of the allegations, however, resulted in an exoneration of the officer, or they were deemed unfounded, meaning the police believe either that the incident never occurred and the citizen is fabricating it or lying, or that their complaint is just not based on the facts.
Did you find, looking at these allegations, that there's a disparity in what the allegations are, meaning there's not really a national standard for what you're seeing here?
Yeah, so every police department has a different way of processing these complaints. So whereas some might just have an online form that any person can go online and fill out and write what they say happened to them, whereas other agencies, have a more formal process where somebody may have to actually come into the office and swear in a complaint. And so just the differences in those processes are going to lead to different results. If you have one of those sworn processes, you're really going to get a lot fewer complaints. It's a much more intimidating and time-consuming process than just filling something out online. And so that led to wide disparities in the number of allegations received. And then as a result of that, also more complaints being unfounded at some departments than others.
He's Kenny Jacoby doing crack analysis and work here. He's the National Public Safety Data Reporter for GateHouse Media. You can follow Kenny Jacoby on Twitter. His Twitter handle is, conveniently enough, Kenny Jacoby. Kenny, thanks so much for your time and reporting. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.